Good evening et bonsoir. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Catherine Spencer-Ross, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa and chair of its lecture series committee. I'm delighted to welcome you to our celebration of Heritage Week, which Heritage Ottawa marks with its annual Phillips Memorial Lecture. First, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the development of the National Capital Region as we now know it. For hundreds of years, Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. Our free lecture series is made possible with the support of Sandy Smallwood and Andrex Holdings and Merkley Supply Limited. We're also grateful for grants from the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. I'd also like to thank those of you who are members and those who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa and encourage this great way to support our work. Please visit our website at heritageottawa.org for details. And now, on to the Phillips Memorial Lecture. This annual event was inaugurated by Heritage Ottawa in 2006 and is dedicated to the founders 58 years ago of the organization that is now known as Heritage Ottawa. In 1967, during Canada's centenary, Bob and Mary Ann Phillips created an advocacy group called A Capital for Canadians. Its Heritage Committee was the beginning of Heritage Ottawa, which was incorporated in 1974. Bob Phillips was its first president. In those early years, with a tremendous personal commitment, Bob and Mary Ann undertook information campaigns and public activism to save key historic buildings and structures in Ottawa that were under threat. Structures as diverse as the Billings House, Pretoria Bridge, Union Station, and yes, even the East Block of Parliament Hill. What would Parliament Hill look like today without that anchor in the east? I think we can say without exaggeration that Bob and Mary Ann Phillips, whose photos you see on the screen, were the founders of built heritage consciousness and advocacy in Ottawa. Their daughters have joined us online. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us for this annual lecture that celebrates your parents and honors the strength of heritage awareness in Ottawa and the National Capital Region, to which Bob and Mary Ann devoted so much time, energy, and effort. Thank you for being with us this evening. Bob and Mary Ann were also on the leading edge of a heritage movement across Canada. 6 years after establishing Heritage Ottawa, in 1973, Bob Phillips became the first executive director of the Heritage Canada Foundation, now the National Trust for Canada, which celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2023. Which brings us to this evening and another 50th anniversary. In the heady days of the late 60s and 1970s, Ontario got into the Heritage Act. Really, literally. In 1975, it passed the Ontario Heritage Act, a piece of legislation that has endured with updates to the present day. It's currently undergoing a review, so I expect it will continue to influence heritage in this province. As an aside, Heritage Ottawa has for years continued to advocate for legislation at the federal level to protect our national heritage assets, many of which are in Ottawa. Sadly, our latest efforts with Bill C-23, the Historic Places of Canada Act, which reached second reading during the last session of the House, will most likely die on the order paper because of the government's prorogation. But back to existing legislation, the Ontario Heritage Act. You only have to look around communities across the province to see designated heritage conservation districts, a direct result of the Act. Ottawa alone has 20 of them, with likely more to come. There are numerous heritage properties in the city designated under Part 4 of the Act. Since it came into force 50 years ago, the Ontario Heritage Act has been an important element in Heritage Ottawa's advocacy toolbox. We will share a few case studies in the last presentation this evening. So let's get on with it. We have 4 speakers this evening. At the end of the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Heritage Ottawa board member Emily Gee. Thank you, Emily, for taking on this role. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and our first speaker, former Ontario Minister of Culture, Madeleine Meilleur. This is the first time that Heritage Ottawa has had the honour of hearing from a minister who oversaw the implementation of significant changes to legislation. During her professional career, Madeleine Meilleur has worked as a nurse, a lawyer, and a politician at municipal, regional, and provincial levels of government. Following her retirement from political life, Madeleine joined the Institute on Governance as senior associate, advising on public sector governance, service delivery, political life, and empowerment of women in public life. She is currently executive director of Musée Parc in Vanier. She was a cabinet minister in the governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. It was as Premier McGuinty's Minister of Culture in 2005 that she pushed through significant changes to the Ontario Heritage Act, which was 30 years old at the time. Madeleine is going to share with us her personal reflections on this important milestone. Madeleine, thank you so much for being part of our event this evening. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this important event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Ontario Heritage Act. First, I wish to pay tribute to all of you who have kept advocating for the protection of local heritage in Ottawa. As a municipal councillor, I was devastated whenever an historic property was presented to us for demolition. At that time, we had no tools at our disposal for heritage building preservation. The only recourse we had was the demolition delay provisions. Later on, after I entered provincial politics, I had an opportunity as the Minister of Culture to intervene and correct the situation, and I did. Just to go back in history a bit, I was elected the MPP for Ottawa-Vanier in October 2003 and appointed to cabinet as the Minister of Culture. With the help of a dedicated civil servant and the support of all heritage groups in the province, on April 28, 2005, Bill 60, the Ontario Heritage Amendment Act, received royal assent and became law. I still remember sitting in the House late that evening, the gallery almost empty. Only a few people were sitting there, waiting anxiously for the vote. These were mostly civil servants from my ministry who had been supportive throughout. There was also a special guest who was in attendance, one of my constituents, a fearless advocate for heritage preservation, and a personal friend, Sandy Smallwood. You know Sandy, how devoted he was, and he still is. I remember quite well when the speaker called for the vote, and even though I believe I had the support of all parties in the House, I could feel my heart beating, my hands wet, and my eyes blurred with tears. The bill was adopted unanimously. This amendment to the Ontario Heritage Law has been 25 years in waiting, according to the staff in my ministry. With this new bill coming into effect, new important powers were assigned to municipalities and to the minister. Most importantly, the bill provided for demolition control powers as opposed to demolition delay provision. Conservation of historic properties is a positive goal for all municipalities. It fosters capital investment in preservation, offers cultural opportunities for community and visitors, and provides provincial and national interest as well as world recognition. Let's just think for a moment about Quebec City, which was rated by Vogue magazine as one of the 11 best destinations to visit outside of US. It's done because of the Quebec City, the old Quebec City, and the preservation that they did and they continue. So we have to congratulate them for that. So in closing, I wanted to thank Catherine for her exemplary work with Heritage Ottawa, and thank you for inviting me to share this story. Thanks all of you for your courage and determination to protect our history through protecting our heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine, for your comments and certainly for your significant contributions to preserving our heritage. And I agree with you about Sandy Smallwood. He's a real treasure. I'll now introduce our other three presenters. Victoria Angel is an art historian with a graduate degree in heritage conservation. She has experience in private, public, and academic sectors. At Parks Canada, she led the development of the Canadian Register of Historic Places and was the manager of the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office. She has taught heritage conservation at the University of Victoria and Carleton University, where she's an adjunct professor. She is a principal at ERA Architects, Inc., working primarily in the areas of cultural landscape analysis, neighborhood studies, and conservation planning for large-scale rehabilitation and adaptive reuse projects, among which are the Senate of Canada Building Rehabilitation, the National Arts Centre Rejuvenation, the Booth Street Redevelopment, and the Kawiki or Nepean Point Redevelopment, and is currently the Senior Heritage Planner at the Centre Block Rehabilitation. Next, Marcus Letourneau is president of MR Letourneau and Associates, Inc., a specialized heritage and strategic planning firm focused on creative solutions for the management of cultural heritage resources. With over 20 years of experience in heritage legislation and strategic planning, he has been involved in over 300 projects related to heritage conservation, land use planning, and cultural heritage landscapes. Marcus is an adjunct assistant professor at the School of Planning in the University of Waterloo and an instructor for the Cultural Resource Management Program at the University of Victoria. Marcus is the founder of LHC Heritage Planning and Archaeology, Inc., an Ontario-based heritage consultancy firm from 2015 to 2023. He taught at Algonquin College in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University, was a senior cultural heritage specialist with Golder Associates Limited, and a senior heritage planner at the City of Kingston. Last, but definitely not least, Robert Peugeot is a dedicated Heritage Ottawa board member and chair of our workshop committee. Over his 30-year career in the field of heritage conservation, Rob has worked in the private sector, for government, the City of Ottawa, and the Federal Heritage Centre of Expertise, and at the National Trust for Canada, a non-governmental organization, where he was project leader for regeneration. Rob has volunteered for heritage organizations at the local and national levels, where he's contributed to advocacy and professional development activities. That's quite a group to have on this lecture, so thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here to share your expertise with us this evening, and Victoria, I'm going to pass control over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much to Heritage Ottawa for having me tonight. You can just go to the next slide. So I'd like to start by briefly setting the stage for the origins of the Ontario Heritage Act. The provincial system as we know it today in many ways traces its origins to the 1950s and 60s, an important period of growth, development, and infrastructure projects within cities. Prior to this period, historical societies were among the principal actors in the heritage movement. Provincial government activities were largely focused on commemoration and education, as well as the designation of archaeological sites. And built heritage conservation was focused on a very narrow swath of historic places, such as military sites. When post-war development and with it demolition and urban clearance schemes spurred people and local governments to organize, a couple of trends were notable in Ontario. The first was the absence of a unified framework and system. There was no central definition of heritage or criteria for its evaluation. And relatedly, the national and provincial governments, rather than making efforts to centralize responsibility for heritage management, encouraged local efforts coordinated by upper-level bodies. Next slide. So, as noted, it was during the 1950s and 60s that local governments and citizens began to advocate for provincial legislation and programs responding to a growing need. Several municipalities across the province were active during this period. Toronto, Hamilton, Peterborough, Kingston, and Ottawa, just to name a few. And I'm going to briefly highlight the efforts of Kingston and Ottawa as examples of what happened. In 1962, because neither the Municipal Act nor the Planning Act offered protection against demolition, Kingston City Council passed its own architectural control bylaw to enable them to delay demolition of listed historic places. The Kingston bylaw borrowed from a number of legislative models using listing, zoning, a board of architectural review, and certificates of approval for alterations and delayed demolition. In Ottawa, various committees advocated for the conservation of historic places. These included a local committee on historic landmarks of the Community Planning Association of Canada, formed in 1957, which developed what may have been Ottawa's first preliminary list of historic places and criteria for evaluation. There was the group A Capital for Canadians, formed by the local Council of Women, whose mandate was to beautify the capital for the centennial. And their subsequent Heritage Committee was the precursor to Heritage Ottawa. And then ultimately, there was the Mayor's Committee on Heritage, formed in 1972, and a private bill that gave Ottawa's municipal government the authority to designate buildings, to acquire them, and to make grants to building owners. Next slide. Finally, in 1971, in response to advocacy efforts, the provincial government initiated a detailed study to identify cross-province conservation challenges and make recommendations on legislative tools to address them. Contemporary conservation techniques across Europe and North America were examined, and the following recommendations were made. The future program should provide for the protection of both buildings and districts. It should be the shared responsibility of provincial and municipal governments. It should feature the elements common to almost all programs of the period: listing, legal protection, and financial assistance. And it should be integrated into the overall planning process and enacted via amendments to the Planning Act. Also, the work of local governments was to be supported by historic conservation advisory committees comprising elected members of council and co-opted citizens. And the rationale for this was to ensure the awareness and involvement of council members in the process, in contrast with the independent board model. Although designation was to be the shared responsibility of both the province and municipal governments, the underlying assumption was nonetheless that, to quote, the provincial government would wish to maintain the principle of delegating responsibility to municipal governments to the maximum possible extent. Next slide. Almost immediately, the provincial government expressed concern that their proposed role would involve them in controversy. In one memo, the responsible assistant deputy minister suggested that, quote, the legislation should be worded so that the main thrust is that of enabling the municipalities to designate and thus protect buildings of historical and architectural importance. And, quote, if a building is of provincial importance, it is also of municipal importance, and therefore it is likely that it will be protected by municipal designation. Having said that, they believed the province should have the ability and the resources to assist municipalities, notably in assessing alterations and in negotiating to prevent demolition of provincially important structures. Drafting of the legislation began in 1972, and then in 1974, a decision was taken to consolidate all provincial legislation into a single act, one that would also address archaeological sites, as well as the role of the Ontario Heritage Foundation, which had been established in 1967. Then, just before the bill was presented to the House, Cabinet deleted two key clauses. The first dealt with the designation of provincial crown property. The second related to the powers given to the minister to designate provincial heritage. It was felt unwise to involve the minister in restricting the rights of private property owners. On December 12, 1974, the bill that became the Ontario Heritage Act was introduced in the legislature. Part 4 enabled designation of individual properties. Part 5 enabled the designation of conservation districts, and Part 6 provided for the designation of archaeological sites by the minister. The Act also enabled, though it did not require, municipalities to establish local architectural conservation advisory committees, or LACACs, to advise council on heritage matters. Essentially, what it did was to provide a formal legislative framework for municipal initiatives underway since the 1960s. When the Act was passed in 1975, its framework was widely criticized across the province, and it was not expected to remain in place for long without amendments. And little did people know it would largely remain unchanged for the next 20 years. Next slide. The Ontario Heritage Act's original administrative structure was unlike any other of the period in Europe or North America, with primary responsibility for conservation assigned to municipal governments. The provincial system contradicted traditional principles. The legislation was weak, only delaying demolition, and it did not involve the province in designation and protection. The role of experts was left to the discretion of municipal governments, and there was no definition of heritage nor standards and criteria for designation. The system relied on volunteers, municipal politicians, and property owners, supported by the provincial government in the role of facilitator. This framework produced not only a decentralized system, but one in which forms of action and heritage itself were defined at the level of municipalities according to their respective values and priorities. It was clearly a system that would need to change and evolve. Nonetheless, it's important not to overlook the benefits of the early phase of the Ontario Heritage Act within the context of that period, when development in urban cores slowed down considerably and moved to urban peripheries. It became, in that first phase, a system focused on local level capacity building and on the education and empowerment of community members. And through this system, Ontario saw a far higher level of designation activity than any other Canadian jurisdiction. And with that, I'll turn things over to Marcus.
Well, thank you, Victoria. And thank you to Heritage Ottawa for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Heritage Act as it has been and how it has changed, particularly over the last 50 years. But for those of you who know me, and I noticed through the attendees list, there's a few of you, will know that I am a storyteller. And I want to start with this image of this really horrible looking jello mold. And I include it in many of my lectures because of a comment that was made to me by a senior manager that I had. And this person said to me, I look at the Ontario Heritage Act like a jello mold. There's some really chunky stuff in there, but some of it seems pretty thrown together. And that always struck me, that this idea of the different parts of the act, how they interacted, and how through change we could improve that. And as Victoria said, many of the early aspects of the act were not intended for the long term. This idea of provincial powers and authorities was an integral part of some of that early development. Next slide, please. But it is important to note that the Ontario Heritage Act has not been static. And this is actually just a screenshot from e-laws. And this is all of the different versions of the Ontario Heritage Act since January 1st, 2003. And the Ontario Heritage Act has had a lot of small amendments, but it was as mentioned, within 2005 that we really saw some of the big changes and some really positive changes to the act as it had been to that point. However, and if you could just advance the animation, I want to bring attention to this little red circle. Everything above that have been the changes that have been undertaken since November 2017. And I think that is a really important point, that since 2017, there have been really constant change. And as mentioned, the Ontario Heritage Act is going through a review once more. And the Auditor General back in 2021 issued a report that unfortunately I don't think a lot of people paid attention to. And in that report, speaking more generally about planning within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the Auditor General noted that the constant change that has been occurring has created a sense of instability, a sense of, both for the development community and for municipal staff, and indeed I'd argue for the consultancies throughout the province, that it was very difficult and increasingly difficult to keep on top of all of the changes that have been happening. And if you look at some of these changes since 2017, you're talking about changes, November 14th to December 11th, December 12th to December 13th, changes happening quite rapidly. Next slide, please. And for many of us in the field, it feels like we have taken a significant step back, particularly since 2017. I try to take a much longer perspective on the Act itself. Yes, we have seen tremendous change, and there's a lot of debate whether or not these changes are for the better. But when we compare what we have today to what we have before 2005, and there are several of us around the table who remember the pre-2005 Act, we have made progress. It's hard because what we're seeing now in terms of many of the changes that are occurring within the Act are changes that are taking away things that we've had for a very long period of time. And a great example of this is the ability of municipalities to use listed properties as a flag over a long-term period of time. Next slide, please. But I would argue that, again, not all changes have been negative. I would go back to 2002, and the Government Efficiency Act of that year actually changed the language around the role of heritage committees, saying that we're transforming this from local architectural advisory committees to municipal heritage committees, with the idea and the intent to give a broader based sense of how communities can respond to heritage. It's not just about architecture. Committees can talk about things such as cultural heritage landscape, commemoration programs. We've seen in 2005 the reintroduction of provincial powers and designation, although it has not really been used. We saw the ability of municipalities to create property standards provisions and bylaws to try and address the issue of demolition by neglect. We saw the introduction of standards for things such as heritage conservation district studies and plans. Prior to that, you had tremendous variation across the province. And as was previously mentioned, the ability for municipalities to say no to demolition. There were other things that were going on simultaneously that we must also take into account. So for example, in 2005, there was a revised provincial policy statement issued under the Planning Act. And one of the big changes within that document was a change from the previous 1997 iteration, which said municipalities shall have regard for, and as a senior planner taught me, said, have regard has a very broad definition, to be consistent with. And indeed, even in the most recent 2024 provincial planning statement, you're still seeing clear language that these represent the minimum standards. And I think that's one of the big things that we sometimes forget, is that we now have some strengthened provision through other tools, such as the Planning Act. We also saw the introduction of criteria for designation. We saw in 2006 the introduction of the Ontario Heritage Toolkit, which unfortunately has not been updated. And even in 2021, through Regulation 385/21, we saw that there were efforts to standardize how Ontario Heritage applications should look, how bylaws should be, what are the standard formats for bylaws. So I'd argue that, when we often think about change, we are focusing sometimes on the negative, but there have been positive events. And I'd also point to some of the really important court decisions that have occurred that have reinforced the ability of municipalities to act in the public interest. There was actually in Ottawa, the 1982 Supreme Court case focusing upon a church where there was a clear ruling that the Ontario Heritage Act did allow municipalities to, quote, interfere with private property rights. And this was followed by a case in 2003 in southwestern Ontario, Tremblay and Lakeshore, where you had a direct quoting from that Supreme Court decision. You've had other court decisions, such as the case around Alma Estates and which was against the town of St. Thomas, which clarified that decisions must be based upon the heritage attributes of a designation bylaw. So what we have seen is support from the court system for the protection of cultural heritage resources in our communities. That being said, the 1982 Supreme Court decision did have another line, and it's this line which is increasingly become a point of discussion, which is a statement that, designation does not have to, basically can override private property rights, but cannot be in total, basically, violation of them. There has to be some balance there. And what that looks like has not really been tested in the courts to this point. Next slide, please. And I say but. Next slide. There's been a real interesting debate and pushback with some of these changes. As Victoria discussed, what you had was a very decentralized system with the creation of the Ontario Heritage Act. Increasingly, what you are seeing is a more centralized, basically from the province, clear direction on what is expected. And you're seeing efforts at greater homogenization. But arguably, one of the side effects is the loss of municipal autonomy. You are seeing greater litigiousness in terms of appeals. Actually, Victoria's thesis did a wonderful discussion on this around the time of the 2005 Act, which was, as we increasingly regulate, the appeals will become more charged. They will become focused upon not just the idea of heritage, but upon the process. And one of the things I often tell my students is I know lawyers and planners who don't know anything about heritage, but they know about process. And those are the things that they look at. With some of the changes that have happened, municipalities have lost some tools. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that the loss of listing, or the transformation, to be more accurate, of listing as basically a holding point for designation, and the amount of work that is now required to list a property is akin to the process of designation. Municipalities are really having to look critically at their programs. I'm the chair of a municipal heritage committee in Eastern Ontario, outside of Gananoque. And we use listed properties as a means to give grants. And we actually our mayor raised the issue, saying we want to continue to list properties. We've got homeowners who want to remain as listed properties because we give grants. And what it meant for our small little heritage committee is we had to rethink our entire program. There are other tools available. Some of these, though, are becoming increasingly difficult to use. So I've seen municipalities across the province look at tools such as heritage character areas through official plan policies, using demolition control. And a couple of municipalities have actually put that directly into their official plans. I have seen municipalities look at, greater incentives for new designations. But it's proving to be really challenging. And I think it's interesting that while we're in this sort of dynamic situation, when we look at the 2024 PPS, you are seeing still supportive language for municipalities to think about how they would like to do certain things. So under 464, planning authorities are encouraged to develop and implement proactive strategies for conserving significant built heritage resources and cultural heritage landscapes. I think there's some good ideas that could be drawn from that, good approaches, things like thematic history. But again, this is really focused on a particular type of cultural heritage resources. And without getting too technical, the idea of significant carries with it a very particular definition. Similarly, we are seeing greater language recognizing that Indigenous heritage must be identified and protected as well. That being said, at this point, there is no clear guidance. And I would say it's no clear guidance both from municipalities and in the consultancy, but also for many Indigenous communities as well. Next slide, please. I also think we have to take into account what I like to call the new reality. I am someone who has worked with heritage for now over 25 years. I think heritage is a very important and critical part of our communities. But increasingly, it's difficult to basically say to people, you need to do X, when people are getting told we have other issues. And we do have significant other issues that we are addressing in our communities. We are now being given, as planners, we have targets given by the province for municipalities of how much they will grow. We have issues. I have a son who's in college, and he regularly talks to me about, Dad, will I be able to buy a house? I'm hearing I'm not going to be able to buy a house. And this is proving challenging. And we are seeing issues of inequality within our society. And one of the things that I'm often asked is, with these changes and with the changes that are coming forward in the Act, is there that opportunity to have the conversations about how heritage is not a barrier to addressing many of these things, but can actually present new opportunities? And at that point, I believe I will be turning it over to Rob.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and good evening, everybody. And so Victoria and Marcus have presented both the origin story of the Act and the plot twists and turns since over the past 50 years. So what I would like to do is take a look a little bit at the legacy of the Act over the past 50 years here in Ottawa, quite quickly. But first, an important disclaimer. Even though I did work at the City of Ottawa briefly as a student for a few years and sat on the City of Ottawa LACAC, I'm a recent board member to the Heritage Ottawa, so I cannot claim any responsibility for any of these stories. And it's even intimidating to talk about them because many of the people involved in some of these stories are actually listening in right now. So there's a risk of misrepresentation here, and it's making me nervous, but hopefully you will bear with me. So with that, I want to present some of the legacy, as I mentioned. We can't really start talking about this without first mentioning the actual City of Ottawa itself, its heritage program that was, as both Victoria and Marcus mentioned, Ottawa was quite innovative and was an early adopter. I think it had, if not the first heritage planner on staff, it was very early on that City of Ottawa had a heritage planner, and have maintained that staff level, well, increasingly, and there's quite a few more than when I was there, ever since. The City of Ottawa was very much an early adopter of the Heritage Conservation District model, and several early Heritage Conservation Districts were established in the city. But there are many other aspects to the Heritage Program, the Heritage Grant Program, involving heritage or integrating heritage in the other planning elements, such as the heritage overlay, and even even more recently, the property standards bylaw, which Marcus alluded to, that includes specific rules about the maintenance and minimum standards for heritage designated buildings. So the city has been very proactive, and its heritage is quite integrated into what the City of Ottawa does. But the most visible part of it, of course, are the designated buildings in the city. We have over 300 individually Part 4 designated buildings and over 20 conservation districts, heritage conservation districts, which means hundreds of other Part 5 designated buildings. So it's a remarkable legacy just from what the City of Ottawa has achieved as an organization. But on the ground, I want to start with this one because this is a story that's sort of near and dear to Heritage Ottawa. And in fact, it's our logo. The building, the Aberdeen Pavilion, the 1898 Aberdeen Pavilion is in our logo as an organization. Now, this wonderful, as I said, 1898 Victorian era exhibition hall is quite rare. It's quite a rare example. And over its 125-year history, that dome has been seen from around the city, and the site has witnessed so many things, from First World War military muster of the Patricia Pat's light infantry, the Ottawa Senators precursors, the Silver Seven, won the Stanley Cup in this building. And that building has seen many young children being sick after having too much hot dogs and junk food after being at the X, myself being one of them. So it has a remarkable history, but I think many of us listening will remember this sorry site, the condition of the building for a very long period. And what we've described as an epic battle to save the building took place, started really when the City of Ottawa took over the responsibility and management for the Lansdowne Park in 1973. The building was recommended for designation under the Ontario Heritage Act in 1979, but City Council postponed that decision to designate until feasibility studies were complete. And I do this because, the air quotes, because this is a theory, the beginning of a theme. The city had very big plans for Lansdowne Park to make it a much more attractive and a larger destination, even way back when. And so began a long series of consultations, planning exercises, and which really raised a number of concerns in the local community and within Heritage Ottawa, which really began to rally around the building. The building was designated as a National Historic Site in 1983, so the federal government's commemorative designation, and then just the year later, 1 year later, designated finally by City Council, agreed to the Part 4 designation. But in this time, there were more plans for the Lansdowne Park, demolition permits approved, returned over. It was an epic battle for the saving of the Aberdeen Pavilion. It was finally condemned and closed to the public in 1987. But it was really with Heritage Ottawa as one of the key coordinators, citizen participation in the protection of the building. There was structured organization, protests or hands around the pavilion, circling the pavilion. There was a petitions that circulated, high school student letter writing campaign. The citizens of Ottawa really rallied around the building and really promoted its potential as in its reuse. So it eventually, after much debate, a much reduced scope of project was approved in 1992, and the building was restored in 1993, and it has retained and remains a centerpiece to that whole complex. So in terms of the Act's legacy, it is one of, yes, the protection as the Part 4 designation. It's also the collaboration with the federal government and the provincial level of government. And one of the other aspects of the Ontario Heritage Act that wasn't really mentioned was, I believe it's under Part 3, is the creation of the Ontario Heritage Trust and its powers. And the Heritage Trust has a heritage conservation easement, which also protects the building as well as view planes towards the building. So it really has become a symbol, not only just for us, but for the city, of what the Act can achieve and the importance of the citizen participation. Another example, and we've talked about Sandy, and we're going to talk about again Sandy Smallwood, Wallace House, 1873-75, built as the Carleton County Protestant Hospital, but then was added on to as the hospital. It was when the Civic Hospital on Carling Avenue was built, it was purchased by the Roman Catholic Diocese as a seminary. In the Second World War, the federal government military purchased it to house its first ever female regiment, the Wrens, the Women's Naval Services. But forgive me, Wrens, I forget the official title. During the war, and then right after the war, it housed military veterans and their families upon their return. And then up until 1990, housed within the federal government, had various regiments and cadet corps in the building. But in 1990, the federal government declared it surplus and attempted to sell it at market value, which didn't work. And so the federal government planned to demolish it. Again, it was right in 1990. It was designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and again, the citizen advocacy role of identifying this as an important landmark in the city of Ottawa, and the Heritage Ottawa played again another significant role with I think Louisa Coates was our president at the time. A large demonstration and protest out front. And really garnered a lot of public attention about this building and its potential. There were lots of plans to demolish, lots of negotiations, wheeling and dealing. But then in stepped our dear friend Sandy Smallwood, who we've mentioned, Sandy and Andrex Holding, sponsors of this lecture series, but who came together with an innovative approach to putting a package together for the project first that would save the building. Which saw the ability to sell off portions of the site both to another developer for market-based housing and to the city of Ottawa for affordable housing. The sale of that would then fund the renovation to the building of the Wallace House itself, which was really Ottawa's first loft conversion project, which resulted in some amazing but quirky spaces in the building. It received federal or provincial funding as well, and I believe from the city of Ottawa. So again, that creative financing partnerships with the private sector, with the city, and looking at an innovative model and a developer that really understood heritage buildings and respected them, and was able to deal with the as I said, quirky, some of the requirements for putting in mezzanines, for example, in some of the units required some really cool engineering solutions, which are wonderful to see that creativity being applied. I thought I'd match that with a more recent example of something similar. Part 4 designated the St. Charles Church on Beechwood Belchas, I can't remember the name of the side street. A recent allowing for on this Part 4 designated site increased density for housing, much needed in our area, in our city core, and the retention of the heritage building and the creation of great exterior public spaces with the new forecourt, which was retained. So again, the Part 4 designation allowing for that kind of flexibility and innovation in the conceptualizing of these spaces and these both private and public spaces. Another one that is an ongoing story, I think we all know the 1890s St. Bridget's Church, which was originally Irish Catholic English for speaking community in Lower Town, that designated Part 4 announced the diocese, although it had received funding and from a grant program from the City of Ottawa and the province of Ontario, and has a heritage conservation easement, was sold by the diocese. It was announced for sale in 2006. Again, public support rallying around it for the saving of the church resulted in a sale to private interests for the creation of the Centre for the Arts, St. Bridget Centre for the Arts for Irish Canadian Centre for the Arts. So a creative new use, great little pub in the basement. But it is an ongoing issue and the challenge for that use. There is still that flexibility, as I was mentioning about the interior of the church, because of the murals, and the interior was in part because of the murals, but the interior was designated. But recognizing that they needed more flexibility, there was an application to modify or alter in the removal of the pews, which are character-defining elements, which was accepted and Heritage Ottawa supported, because you need that flexibility for the ongoing use. So it's an example of how the Act has to be flexible. Now, just very quickly, because I mentioned them off the top, but another one of the legacies of the Act is the heritage conservation districts that we have in Ottawa, over 20 of them that represent all different typologies, from commercial, mixed commercial, residential, a modern, the Briarcliff Heritage Conservation District. And they have been a remarkable tool for managing the built environment, managing change, and allowing for change. The example in the top left of infill on a Barry Podolsky project on Laurier Avenue, it is a means of allowing, recognizing the importance of these character neighborhoods and managing the change within them. I'm going to just keep going here. Now, the Act has not been all positive. I think the past 50 years have seen quite a few losses. I think some of you will remember the former Ottawa Police headquarters, a modernist building that many advocates advocated for its designation, but City Council and a large number of members of the public weren't really supportive of it. What is considered heritage and what has public acceptance as heritage has evolved over time. So the Act, although it allowed it, it sometimes takes a while for the two to blend. And so this is one unfortunate example of a loss that we had. And there are many other ones that I won't get too far into. Some of the more prominent ones that Heritage Ottawa was involved with, the Nicholas Waller Triangle, when the Ottawa University and private developers, a number of buildings were demolished without approval very quickly, which resulted in a loss of the heritage buildings, but also the end results of compensation having to be paid out in an out-of-court settlement, which then also led into some of the things we've talked about, property standards, and it has the lessons learned from these things. This kind of activity has fed into the City of Ottawa's procedures, and the same thing for Somerset House, another very sad story at the corner of Bank and Somerset, that in 2007 was partially collapsed during renovations, and then a later, quite a similar story. But I don't want to end on a sad note, and I'm just about to wrap up here. The legacy that we have in Ottawa, I was born and raised in Ottawa. The image of Ottawa that is often portrayed is really those federal buildings. It's overshadowing often the crown, often overshadowing the town. But we do have a remarkable range and legacy of buildings here in Ottawa, from within Ottawa and the former townships and cities around it, from institutional, a range of types of buildings, bridges, residences, commercial. And so I didn't really want to end on that sad note. It's actually quite a positive note. We have a remarkable inventory of designated buildings, and the Act has allowed us not only to protect them, but there have also been intangible components or legacies of the Act. And I think all of us here on this session tonight are part of that legacy, in that we as citizens in our advocacy work and the recognition of the importance of this is part of the Act's legacy. We together make for these the protection of these and the vitality of these buildings on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to wrap it up with that, and I'll invite my other panelists to come on board and turn it over to Emily.
So first and foremost, I would like to thank all of you for your presentations this evening. I think we've covered a pretty broad overview of the Ontario Heritage Act, from the historical origins to ongoing changes, challenges to the legislation, to examples from Ottawa, the good, the bad, the flexibility, the missed opportunities, the great opportunities. So with the understanding that we all come to heritage from different backgrounds, different experiences, I thank you all for speaking tonight and for agreeing to take a few questions. So you're now, as the group, invited to pose some questions to our speakers. And as Catherine mentioned in her introduction, please use the Q&A function, which appears at the bottom of your screen. And I'll moderate the questions and comments for repetition and length. So as you start to think about some questions, I am using this opportunity to maybe start off some discussion just with one of my own. And as heritage professionals and as heritage advocates, you know, we all pay attention to what's going on around us, reading the news, and heritage designation and designation in general seems to be getting somewhat of a bad rap these days, or at least in certain circles. So for example, we're seeing more headlines citing heritage as a limitation rather than an opportunity, be it regarding affordable housing, barriers, red tape, so on and so forth. So as heritage professionals, and anyone can weigh in on this, please feel free, our panelists, do you have any feelings about how heritage can mobilize in a more positive way going forward? It's a bit of a loaded question. I'll let any one of you take take that one on.
I'm just going to weigh in with something really simple and obvious, and that's that beyond the heritage sector, there's a very lively discussion going on about using what already exists. And you know, I think that that's one of the most exciting discussions underway, discussions about circular economy, about, you know, the greenest building being the one that already exists. And so that I think is a discussion that is imbued with excitement and creative possibilities, and we really need to focus and leverage that in every way we can.
Just to build on what Victoria has said, I think two things that I would say, and to quote a colleague of ours, heritage does have a bit of a branding issue. I think there needs to be a broader conversation about the positives, and I can attest that I know the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, for example, as part of one of their submissions to the Government of Ontario, actually gave examples of how you can integrate affordable housing into adaptive reuse projects. So these sorts of documents, to be able to respond very directly to claims that, well, heritage means you can't do anything, these traditional I would almost say myths and misconceptions, which still persist. And the fact I think that they do still persist means that we have to do a better job in actually addressing some of the questions and concerns that are being raised. The other piece that I would say, and I see it as myself, one of the biggest issues within the heritage field today is the issue of insurance. We see a lot of discussions across the province around the point of insurance. The province did do a discussion with the insurance industry. I think it was back in 2011, and the municipal heritage planners had an engagement around the same time with the insurance industry. Unfortunately, those discussions do not seem to have persisted. You do have changeover in the industry, and you're seeing heritage in many insurance circles being seen automatically as a risk. And I think it's a conversation about what having a heritage property actually means. I think it goes back to those myths and misconceptions about, and I've actually seen this from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Heritage means you have to put it back exactly the way it is. And I think the insurance and the heritage communities need to have stronger conversations. Looking across, as I say, the province, there have been a number of cases in the media where that is the reason why homeowners are currently objecting to designations.
Which is really not even a heritage issue. The insurance issue is actually a bit of a red herring. It's not a heritage issue. The insurance industry is in a crisis due to climate change, massive payouts, and so we're a scapegoat. But the Insurance Bureau of Canada has recently revised some of their documents. They're actually having some pretty good advice out there, but it will take a coordinated response on that issue. But Emily, my feeling is that it's a multi-pronged approach. I think different audiences need to hear different stories and different aspects of heritage. I mean, the work Heritage Ottawa does in our walking tours and this lecture series reaches a certain audience. I mean, a lot of the converted, of course, but it also tells stories. We're about storytelling through our communication. So as an advocacy organization, it behooves us to continue to share the stories of adaptive reuse and interesting things, and to answer some of those questions. And as heritage professionals, being aware of what's happening around the world, there are some great stories. I mean, English Heritage did a great study on the benefits for mental health and heritage. There are things, arguments that can be made. And of course, what Victoria mentioned, the green argument is one of the strongest ones, that the embodied carbon in our existing building, whether heritage or not, is too important to ignore. So there are lots of things that we can do collectively. And I don't think there's a single strategy. I think it's going to be multi-pronged, and sharing the positives with technical information and storytelling, I think all around.
Madeleine, do you want to finish with?
I think that we should. I gave, some positive aspect to heritage. It brings tourists. It brings you're proud of your community when you show around. You don't show the 50-story condo on Dow's Lake. You show the heritage property when you go around. And it also, I think, but I'll say, bring joy to the people, when they go and they see what they have done. Also, like the church on Beechwood, it's a transformation. The church still there, but there is a condo there, and there is a park in the front of the church, and there is activities, summer and winter. So sometimes they will try to convince council to demolish a property, and the argument that they bring forward to have more chances, we are going to build, affordable housing. But then when it's built, there's no affordable housing when it's, $2,500 or $3,000 per month. So and I thank Robert for watching, to protect and try and working hard to protect the heritage with your committee. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you all for taking that one on. That's a big question with a lot of, and it sort of lends itself to a series of other questions, and I can see some popping up. So I'll do my best at trying to blend some of these together. But in our discussion of the Act itself, we did bring up some of the topic of the Ontario Heritage Toolkit, something that hasn't been reviewed or renewed, or we don't have any version of it. So just in light of one of the questions we have here, we believed as heritage professionals and heritage advocates that the toolkit was so important because municipalities, heritage committees, citizens, and property owners needed to know how the Ontario Heritage Act worked. To effectively build support for designation and conservation. So to our panelists, whoever wants to jump in here, do you feel that there's a good understanding of how the Act works today?
I'm going to jump right in.
I was like, I know who's going to start this off.
It's unfortunate, and it goes back to my comment about some of the constant change. I think people have trouble following all of the changes that have happened, and that have happened quite rapidly. I can attest, I've been in meetings with colleagues and with legal counsel arguing over what is the interpretation of the Act today. And I know that there's many people who have been in that circumstance within our industry. And that is part of the challenge that we face right now. But I look at the homeowner, I look at the average homeowner. Where do they get their information? Where are they getting the detail? The Ontario Heritage Toolkit, even though it was very outdated, was still very useful. And I actually, about a year and a half ago, I had it as a reading in my class, and the students came up midterm and said, it's off the website. And it's like, oh, and it literally just disappeared off the website without any sort of, heads up that this was happening. And I know that there has been drafts. I know that on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, drafts have been presented. And I've reviewed the drafts, and I've pointed to the drafts for some people. But for many people, this is really specialized where you find it on ERO. And I remember even starting as a planner, not fully understanding what the ERO is. So I don't think that we have done a great job of walking through the Act. I mean, one of the things I've suggested is we need flowcharts, just even simple flowcharts that show how the process works, who is involved at the various steps.
Victoria.
I'm going to add to what Marcus was saying, with the evolution of the system, and I mean, Marcus did a great job of describing this very legalistic system that evolved over time. And I guess, Marcus also alluded to the fact that, a lot has been gained with the evolution of the system, but something's been lost. And that is, I think, the ability of ordinary people to engage without, a really strong legal background, without being a development planner. It is incredibly difficult to engage in the current system and to really understand it. So I think it's become a system for professionals and for legal experts, and much less one that's sort of penetrable to citizens.
There was actually, building off what Victoria is saying, there was an article a number of years ago by a professor at Athabasca called Fitzpanicek, and he wrote a wonderful article called The Rise of the Heritage Priesthood. And that's his exact point was, with these increased specifications, you are building a body that separates the process from the people. And I think that's where we have grown as a system, that it is become increasingly complex and increasingly specialized. I can say as a consultant, I do very little work under the provincial EA process because it has its own language. I tend to focus on Heritage Act and certain Planning Act matters, but I don't deal with archaeology. And so even within the one piece of legislation, you're seeing this growing specialization. And I admit myself, I need to turn to my colleagues at time and say, this is not my expertise. Can you explain this to me?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's interesting in this discussion and with the contributions you've offered. I start to see the chat, and there's lots of interesting examples people are providing, and comments, and then some questions. And to try and group them all, like I don't think I'll be able to do that, but I do have one that I think we might be able to touch on a few things. So obviously, like we were talking before, there's things in the news, so on and so forth, about heritage that have come up, and just a general understanding, and how do we integrate public contribution more into this, but also sort of, we have the good aspects, but we also still see some pretty negative things happening, and alluding to some of the examples that Rob showed at the end. So we've got a few things that have been happening. The termination of various conservation programs at Algonquin and at St. Lawrence College is. We have a provincial election coming up. When we talk about the OHA and the Ontario Heritage Act, do any of you have any wish list items or some things you'd like to see in any potential changes that rumors and opening up of the Ontario Heritage Act, once again, just to add to the complication of all the things that planners and advocates have to learn. So anything on the top of your mind as to what you'd like to see out of changes going forward? And again, it's a tough question, but
Well, first thing that I would advocate for everyone here who is interested, the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals is actually doing a 4-part discussion on the changes to the Act. I would encourage people who are willing and interested to take a look at that conversation that's happening there. I will say, from a personal perspective, and I'm putting on a personal hat as opposed to my professional hat here, I can say what I'm afraid of. And I'm afraid of 2 possible changes coming forward, which is owner's consent and compensation for designation. Those would be 2 things that I think would be extremely damaging if they are introduced into the Ontario Heritage Act. As some of you know, I did my training in British Columbia through the University of Victoria, and Victoria has compensation. And there was a very famous court case around the chocolate factory and the chocolate shop in Victoria, and the possible expansion on that, and almost the chill effect that has had on designations. What I would like to see, and I think where there's areas for further conversation, I would like to see a greater discussion about the tie of heritage to sustainability, its role in climate change. I would like to see a very clear purpose to the Act, because the Act has no clear purpose stated within it. It does say conservation, preservation, and protection, but as opposed to a lot of other legislation, we don't see that purpose of the Act is X, which I think would be really important in terms of some of these increasingly litigious discussions. And I think the last thing that I think we need to see within the Act is disaster and emergency risk management, and how communities can address things. And I think that would go a long way to address some of the concerns of the insurance industry by saying how are heritage resources addressed within these circumstances. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues for their additions as well.
You covered everything there, Marcus. That was a very,
Yes.
very complete answer. But I will just jump in on one of the points that your preamble to your question, Emily, regarding the cancellation of programs in colleges, specific training in the heritage trades, that's happening at Algonquin College in the Perth campus and in St. Lawrence College. Not Ontario Heritage Act related, but having the trained craftspeople to work on these historic buildings with an understanding of the existing or traditional building technologies is critical. I just want to put a plug in. I'm a former graduate of the Algonquin College Heritage Carpentry program. So the board of Algonquin College is meeting next Monday. If anybody has concerns they can there still is time to write to the board about the closing of the Perth campus, even though they say they will be moving the programs to the Ottawa, the Woodruff campus. There are concerns about the sustainability of that move and the ability of the Algonquin campus here in Ottawa to accommodate the specialized shops and the students. And Perth is such an amazing place to have that program. So if people feel about that, there's an opportunity there that Algonquin, I hope, can seize upon and expand or look at creative ways with partnerships to save the Perth campus. And another, if I'm allowed to have one quick plug as well, Emily, the issue of climate change. I'm also, one of my hats at Heritage Ottawa running. We have a workshop next week on preparing older homes for extreme weather events. It's one of the factors that people have to deal with in the home. So if you're interested, look on the Heritage Ottawa website. I thought I'd give a quick plug before I forget, if I'm allowed.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're kind of winding down here with our time, and we do have a few comments to make at the end. So I don't know if I want to give everybody a final word, or so there's a question here that I just kind of like, because we're celebrating 50 years. So you kind of have answered it with some of the other questions, but we're seeing, I see lots in the comments section about what you've mentioned, sustainability, trying to reduce demolition by neglect, how we're still seeing that happen in the city. We see some great, examples of preservation efforts, but then we're still seeing some other examples that aren't so ideal. But so we're celebrating 50 years. So what do you imagine for the Ontario Heritage Act for the next 50 years? What a question.
I was going to say, what I would like, it's that the act is more strict about protection, because otherwise, all the excuses, will be used to demolish or to transform an heritage property so badly that it's not an heritage property anymore. So I agree that the people that wanted to protect heritage should have some financial support. I think that it's otherwise, I saw when I was the minister, people coming to say, you can take our farm, but if I take the farm, there was so much repair to be done, that then the government was neglecting the property that they had under the Heritage Trust, So it's difficult to find, but that's what my hope that I will see, for the future in the act.
Victoria, did you want to chime in, or?
Sure. I'm going to be very idealistic for a moment here and continue along that sustainability theme. In the next 50 years, I'm hoping for a context in which we don't really need to use the Ontario Heritage Act very much. I'd like to see everything else become very stewardship focused and focused on working with what we already have. And I'd like to see a reality where it's the Ontario Heritage Act only has to be used for very monumental places, which is sort of, the origins of heritage legislation. I'd kind of like to get back to that. So that's idealistic, but that's what I'd like to see.
I think, Victoria, you stole exactly what I was going to say.
That's what I was going to say.
I remember a speech a number of years ago by Randy Mason out of the University of Pennsylvania, and they asked him a very similar question of what do you see for the next 50 years of the heritage conservation field? And he says, I hope in 50 years there is no heritage conservation field because everybody just does the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need for the Heritage Act because the value is recognized. It is recognized by government bodies, it's recognized by the system. That being said, that is very idealistic. But one can hope and dream.
I think that is an excellent way to end this discussion, because we all get tangled in all of it, and it's always nice to end on a positive note, and even if it's idealistic, well, we have to start somewhere, right? So thank you all of you for your presentations once again. And thank you for taking these questions, and thank you to our participants for submitting questions, comments. I will pass them all on to our speakers, and if there's any other things that come up, you do have the opportunity to email them to Heritage Ottawa at info@heritageottawa.org, and we will share those with the speakers as well. So once again, thank you. And just to add a couple of things, so Rob's already done a little bit in the way of plugging some of our upcoming programming, which is great, because the more we can get people involved in some of this exciting programming, the better we can meet some of the goals that we've outlined today for Heritage for the next 50 years. So first, Heritage Ottawa has developed a two-part workshop that Rob was speaking about for homeowners to prepare for extreme weather events. So join us online for that on March 6th for part 1, which will focus on how weather impacts the landscape elements of your home. Our experts will address rain management strategies and tree care. So please visit our website for a bunch more information on that. And then secondly, Heritage Ottawa will present its next lecture online the 19th of March. Hajit Hadaya will show us the Ottawa residences that 12 prime ministers occupied before 24 Sussex became the official residence of Canada's prime ministers. Shortly, you will be able to register for this lecture on our website also, which is heritageottawa.org. And finally, as mentioned at the beginning, Heritage Ottawa lectures are provided free of charge. We encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you're not yet a member, and donate to the organization to help continue efforts to share heritage stories. Information is also available on the website. And with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you for organizing that.
Okay.